Chapter 21 of The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hour of the Dragon. Chapter 21 Drums of Peril. Confirmation of the war came when the army of Poitain, 10,000 strong, marched through the southern passes with waving banners and shimmer of steel. And at their head, the spies swore, rode a giant figure in black armor, with the royal lion of Aquilonia worked in gold upon the breast of his rich silken surcoat. Conan lived. The king lived. There was no doubt of it in men's minds now, whether friend or foe. With the news of the invasion from the south there also came word, brought by hard-riding couriers, that a host of gundermen was moving southward, reinforced by the barons of the northwest and the northern Bossonians. Tarascus marched with 31,000 men to Galparan on the river Shirki, which the gundermen must cross to strike at the town still held by the Nemedians. The Shirki was a swift, turbulent river rushing southwestward through rocky gorges and canyons, and there were few places where an army could cross at that time of the year, when the stream was almost bank full with the melting of the snows. All the country east of the Shirki was in the hands of the Nemedians, and it was logical to assume that the gundermen would attempt to cross either at Galparan or at Tanasul, which lay to the south of Galparan. Reinforcements were daily expected from Nemedia, until word came that the king of Ophir was making hostile demonstrations on Nemedia's southern border, and to spare any more troops would be to expose Nemedia to the risk of an invasion from the south. Amalric and Valerius moved out from Tarantia with 25,000 men, leaving as large a garrison as they dared to discourage revolts in the cities during their absence. They wished to meet and crush Conan before he could be joined by the rebellious forces of the kingdom. The king and his Poitanians had crossed the mountains, but there had been no actual clash of arms, no attack on towns or fortresses. Conan had appeared and disappeared. Apparently, he had turned westward through the wild, thinly settled hill country and entered the Bossonian marches, gathering recruits as he went. Amalric and Valerius, with their host, Nemedians, Aquilonian renegades, and ferocious mercenaries, moved through the land in baffled wrath, looking for a foe which did not appear. Amalric found it impossible to obtain more than vague general tidings about Conan's movements. Scouting parties had a way of riding out and never returning, and it was not uncommon to find a spy crucified to an oak. The countryside was up and striking as peasants and country folk strike, savagely, murderously, and secretly. All that Amalric knew certainly was that a large force of gundermen and northern Bossonians was somewhere to the north of him, beyond the Shirki, and that Conan with a smaller force of Poitanians and southern Bossonians was somewhere to the southwest of him. He began to grow fearful that if he and Valerius advanced further into the wild country, Conan might elude him entirely, march around them, and invade the central provinces behind them. Amalric fell back from the Shirki Valley and camped in a plain a day's ride from Tanasul. There he waited. Tarascus maintained his position at Galparan, for he feared that Conan's maneuvers were intended to draw him southward, and so let the gundermen into the kingdom at the northern crossing. To Amalric's camp came Zaltotun in his chariot, drawn by the uncanny horses that never tired, and he entered Amalric's tent where the baron conferred with Valerius over a map spread on an ivory camp table. This map Zaltotun crumpled and flung aside. "What your scouts cannot learn for you," quoth he, "my spies tell me, though their information is strangely blurred and imperfect, as if unseen forces were working against me. Conan is advancing along the Shirki River with 10,000 Poitanians, 3,000 southern Bossonians, and barons of the west and south with their retainers to the number of 5,000. An army of 30,000 gundermen and northern Bossonians is pushing southward to join him. They have established contact by means of secret communications used by the cursed priests of Ashura, who seem to be opposing me, and whom I will feed to a serpent when the battle is over. I swear it by Set. Both armies are headed for the crossing at Tanasul, but I do not believe that the Gundermen will cross the river. I believe that Conan will cross, instead, and join them." "Why should Conan cross the river?" "Because it is to his advantage to delay the battle. The longer he waits, the stronger he will become, the more precarious our position. The hills on the other side of the river swarm with people passionately loyal to his cause, broken men, refugees, fugitives from Valerius' cruelty. From all over the kingdom men are hurrying to join his army, singly and by companies. Daily, parties from our armies are ambushed and cut to pieces by country folk. Revolt grows in the central provinces, and will soon burst into open rebellion. The garrisons we left there are not sufficient, and we can hope for no reinforcements from Nemedia for the time being. I see the hand of Pallantides in this brawling in the Ophirian frontier. He has kin in Ophir. If we do not catch and crush Conan quickly, the provinces will be in a blaze of revolt behind us. We shall have to fall back to Turantia to defend what we have taken, and we may have to fight our way through a country in rebellion, with Conan's whole force at our heels, and then stand siege in the city itself, with enemies within as well as without. No, we cannot wait. We must crush Conan before his army grows too great, before the central provinces rise. With his head hanging above the gate at Turantia, you will see how quickly the rebellion will fall apart." "Why do you not put a spell on his army to slay them all?" asked Valerius, half in mockery. Zeltotun stared at the Aquilonian as if he read the full extent of the mocking madness that lurked in those wayward eyes. "Do not worry," he said at last. "My arts shall crush Conan finally like a lizard under the heel. But even sorcery is aided by pikes and swords." "If he crosses the river and takes up his position in the Goralian hills, he may be hard to dislodge," said Amalric. "But if we catch him in the valley on this side of the river, we can wipe him out. How far is Conan from Tanasul?" "At the rate he is marching, he should reach the crossing sometime tomorrow night. His men are rugged, and he is pushing them hard. He should arrive there at least a day before the Gundermen." "Good!" Amalric smote the table with his clenched fist. "I can reach Tanasul before he can. I'll send a rider to Tarascus, bidding him to follow me to Tanasul. By the time he arrives, I will have cut Conan off from the crossing and destroyed him. Then our combined force can cross the river and deal with the Gundermen." Zeltotun shook his head impatiently. "A good enough plan if you were dealing with anyone but Conan. But your 25,000 men are not enough to destroy his 18,000 before the Gundermen come up. They will fight with the desperation of wounded panthers. And suppose the Gundermen come up while the hosts are locked in battle. You will be caught between two fires and destroyed before Tarascus can arrive. He will reach Tanasul too late to aid you." "What then?" demanded Amalric. "Move with your whole strength against Conan," answered the man from Acheron. "Send a rider bidding Tarascus join us here. We will wait his coming. Then we will march together to Tanasul." "But while we wait," protested Amalric, "Conan will cross the river and join the Gundermen." "Conan will not cross the river," answered Zeltotun. Amalric's head jerked up, and he stared into the cryptic, dark eyes. "What do you mean?" "Suppose there were torrential rains far to the north, at the head of the Shirki. Suppose the river came down in such flood as to render the crossing at Tanasul impassable. Could we not then bring up our entire force at our leisure, catch Conan on this side of the river and crush him? And then, when the flood subsided, which I think it would do the next day, Could we not cross the river and destroy the Gundermen? Thus we could use our full strength against each of these smaller forces in turn." Valerius laughed, as he always laughed at the prospect of the ruin of either friend or foe, and drew a restless hand jerkily through his unruly yellow locks. Amalric stared at the man from Acheron with mingled fear and admiration. "If we caught Conan in Shirki Valley with the hill ridges to his right and the river in flood to his left," he admitted, "with our whole force, we could annihilate him. Do you think, are you sure, do you believe such rains will fall?" "I go to my tent," answered Zaltotun, rising. "Necromancy is not accomplished with the waving of a wand. Send a rider to Tarascus, and let none approach my tent." That last command was unnecessary. No man in that host could have been bribed to approach that mysterious black silken pavilion, the door flaps of which were always closely drawn. None but Zaltotun ever entered it, yet voices were often heard issuing from it. Its walls billowed sometimes without a wind, and weird music came from it. Sometimes, deep in midnight, its silken walls were lit red by flames flickering within, limning misshapen silhouettes that passed to and fro. Lying in his own tent that night, Amalric heard the steady rumble of a drum in Zaltotun's tent. Through the darkness it boomed steadily, and occasionally the Nemedian could have sworn that a deep, croaking voice mingled with the pulse of the drum. And he shuddered, for he knew that voice was not the voice of Zaltotun. The drum rustled and muttered on like deep thunder, heard afar off, and before dawn Amalric, glancing from his tent, caught the red flicker of lightning afar on the northern horizon. In all other parts of the sky the great stars blazed whitely, but the distant lightning flickered incessantly like the crimson glint of firelight on a tiny turning blade. At sunset of the next day, Tarascus came up with his host, dusty and weary from hard marching, the footmen straggling hours behind the horsemen. They camped in the plain near Amalric's camp, and at dawn the combined army moved westward. Ahead of him roved a swarm of scouts, and Amalric waited impatiently for them to return and tell of the Poitanians trapped beside a furious flood. But when the scouts met the column, it was with the news that Conan had crossed the river. "What?" exclaimed Amalric. "Did he cross before the flood?" "There was no flood," answered the scouts, puzzled. "Late last night he came up to Tanasul and flung his army across." "No flood?" exclaimed Zaltotun, taken aback for the first time in Amalric's knowledge. "Impossible! There were mighty rains upon the headwaters of the Shirki last night and the night before that." "That may be, your lordship," answered the scout. "It is true the water was muddy, and the people of Tanasul said that the river rose perhaps a foot yesterday, but that was not enough to prevent Conan's crossing." Zaltotun's sorcery had failed. The thought hammered in Amalric's brain. His horror of this strange man out of the past had grown steadily since that night in Belverus, when he had seen a brown, shriveled mummy swell and grow into a living man. And the death of Orestes had changed lurking horror into active fear. In his heart was a grisly conviction that the man, or devil, was invincible. Yet now he had undeniable proof of his failure. Yet even the greatest of necromancers might fail occasionally, thought the Baron. At any rate, he dared not oppose the man from Acheron, yet. Orestes was dead, writhing in Mitra only knew what nameless hell, and Amalric knew his sword would scarcely prevail where the black wisdom of the renegade priest had failed. What grisly abomination Zaltotun plotted lay in the unpredictable future. Conan and his host were a present menace against which Zaltotun's wizardry might well be needed before the play was all played. They came to Tanasul, a small fortified village at the spot where a reef of rocks made a natural bridge across the river, passable always except in times of greatest flood. Scouts brought in the news that Conan had taken up his position in the Goralian hills, which began to rise a few miles beyond the river, and just before sundown the Gunderman had arrived in his camp. Amalric looked at Zalto Tun, inscrutable and alien in the light of the flaring torches. Night had fallen. "What now? Your magic has failed. Conan confronts us with an army nearly as strong as our own, and he has the advantage of position. We have a choice of two evils: to camp here and await his attack, or to fall back toward Turantia and await reinforcements." "We are ruined if we wait," answered Zalto Tun. "Cross the river and camp on the plain. We will attack at dawn." "But his position is too strong!" exclaimed Amalric. "Fool!" A gust of passion broke the veneer of the wizard's calm. "Have you forgotten Valkia? Because some obscure elemental principle prevented the flood, do you deem me helpless? I had intended that your spear should exterminate our enemies, but do not fear. It is my arts that shall crush their host. Conan is in a trap. He will never see another sun set. Cross the river." They crossed by the flare of torches. The hoofs of the horses clinked on the rocky bridge, splashed through the shallows. The glint of torches on shields and breastplates was reflected redly in the black water. The rock bridge was broad on which they crossed, but even so it was past midnight before the host was camped in the plain beyond. Above them they could see fires winking redly in the distance. Conan had turned at bay in the Goralian hills, which had more than once before served as the last stand of an Aquilonian king. Amalric left his pavilion and strode restlessly through the camp. A weird glow flickered in Zalto Tun's tent, and from time to time a demoniacal cry slashed the silence, and there was a low, sinister muttering of a drum that rustled rather than rumbled. Amalric, his instincts whetted by the night and the circumstances, felt that Zalto Tun was opposed by more than physical force. Doubts of the wizard's power assailed him. He glanced at the fires high above him, and his face set in grim lines. He and his army were deep in the midst of a hostile country. Up there among the hills lurked thousands of wolfish figures out of whose hearts and souls all emotion and hope had been scourged except a frenzied hate for their conquerors, a mad lust for vengeance. Defeat meant annihilation, retreat through a land swarming with blood-mad enemies. And on the morrow he must hurl his host against the grimmest fighter in the Western nations, and his desperate horde. If Zalto Tun failed them now— Half a dozen men-at-arms strode out of the shadows. The firelight glinted on their breastplates and helmet crests. Among them they half led, half dragged a gaunt figure in tattered rags. Saluting, they spoke. "My lord, this man came to the outposts and said he desired word with King Valerius. He is an Aquilonian." He looked more like a wolf the traps had scarred. Old sores that only fetters make showed on his wrists and ankles. A great brand, the mark of hot iron, disfigured his face. His eyes glared through the tangle of his matted hair as he half crouched before the Baron. "Who are you, filthy dog?" demanded the Nemedian. "Call me Tiberius," answered the man, and his teeth clicked in an involuntary spasm. "I have come to tell you how to trap Conan." "A traitor, eh?" rumbled the Baron. "Men say you have gold," mouthed the man, shivering under his rags. "Give some to me. Give me gold, and I will show you how to defeat the king." His eyes glazed widely, his outstretched, upturned hands were spread like quivering claws. Amalric shrugged his shoulder in distaste, but no tool was too base for his use. "If you speak the truth, you shall have more gold than you can carry," he said. "If you are a liar and a spy, I will have you crucified head down. Bring him along." In the tent of Valerius, the Baron pointed to the man who crouched shivering before them, huddling his rags about him. "He says he knows a way to aid us on the morrow. We will need aid if Zaltotun's plan is no better than it has proved so far. Speak on, dog." The man's body writhed in strange convulsions. Words came in a stumbling rush. "Conan camps at the head of the Valley of Lions. It is shaped like a fan, with steep hills on either side. If you attack him tomorrow, you will have to march straight up the valley. You cannot climb the hills on either side. But if King Valerius will deign to accept my service, I will guide him through the hills and show him how we can come upon King Conan from behind. But if it is to be done at all, we must start soon. It is many hours' riding, for one must go miles to the west, then miles to the north, then turn eastward, and so come into the Valley of Lions from behind, as the Gundermen came." Amalric hesitated, tugging his chin. In these chaotic times it was not rare to find men willing to sell their souls for a few gold pieces. "If you lead me astray, you will die," said Valerius. "You are aware of that, are you not?" The man shivered, but his wide eyes did not waver. "If I betray you, slay me." "Conan will not dare divide his force," mused Amalric. "He will need all his men to repel our attack. He cannot spare any to lay ambushes in the hills. Besides, this fellow knows his hide depends on his leading you as he promised. Would a dog like him sacrifice himself? Nonsense. No, Valerius, I believe the man is honest. Or a greater thief than most, for he would sell his liberator," laughed Valerius. "Very well. I will follow the dog. How many men can you spare me?" 5,000 should be enough," answered Amalric. "A surprise attack on their rear will throw them into confusion, and that will be enough. I shall expect your attack about noon." "You will know when I strike," answered Valerius. As Amalric returned to his pavilion, he noted with gratification that Zaltotun was still in his tent, to judge from the blood-freezing cries that shuddered forth into the night from time to time. When presently he heard the clink of steel and the jingle of bridles in the outer darkness, he smiled grimly. Valerius had about served his purpose. The Baron knew that Conan was like a wounded lion that rends and tears even in his death throes. When Valerius struck from the rear, the desperate strokes of the Cimmerian might well wipe his rival out of existence before he himself succumbed. So much the better. Amalric felt he could well dispense with Valerius once he had paved the way for a Nemedian victory. The 5,000 horsemen who accompanied Valerius were hard-bitten Aquilonian renegades for the most part. In the still starlight they moved out of the sleeping camp, following the westward trend of the great black masses that rose against the stars ahead of them. Valerius rode at their head, and beside him rode Tiberius, a leather thong about his wrist gripped by a man-at-arms who rode on the other side of him. Others kept close behind with drawn swords. "Play us false, and you die instantly," Valerius pointed out. "I do not know every sheep path in these hills, but I know enough about the general configuration of the country to know the directions we must take to come in behind the Valley of Lions. See that you do not lead us astray." The man ducked his head and his teeth chattered as he volubly assured his captor of his loyalty, staring up stupidly at the banner that floated over him, the golden serpent of the old dynasty. Skirting the extremities of the hills that locked the Valley of Lions, they swung wide to the west. An hour's ride and they turned north, forging through wild and rugged hills, following dim trails and tortuous paths. Sunrise found them some miles northwest of Conan's position, and here the guide turned eastward and led them through a maze of labyrinths and crags. Valerius nodded, judging their position by various peaks thrusting up above the others. He had kept his bearings in a general way, and he knew they were still headed in the right direction. But now, without warning, a gray, fleecy mass came billowing down from the north, veiling the slopes, spreading out through the valleys. It blotted out the sun. The world became a blind gray void in which visibility was limited to a matter of yards. Advance became a stumbling, groping muddle. Valerius cursed. He could no longer see the peaks that had served him as guideposts. He must depend wholly upon the traitorous guide. The golden serpent drooped in the windless air. Presently, Tiberius seemed himself confused. He halted, stared about uncertainly. "Are you lost, dog?" demanded Valerius harshly. "Listen." Somewhere ahead of them a faint vibration began, the rhythmic rumble of a drum. "Conan's drum!" exclaimed the Aquilonian. "If we are close enough to hear the drum," said Valerius, "why do we not hear the shouts and the clang of arms? Surely battle has joined." "The gorges and the winds play strange tricks," answered Tiberius, his teeth chattering with the ague that is frequently the lot of men who have spent much time in damp underground dungeons. "Listen!" Faintly to their ears came a low, muffled roar. "They are fighting down in the valley!" cried Tiberius. "The drum is beating on the heights! Let us hasten!" He rode straight on toward the sound of the distant drum as one who knows his ground at last. Valerius followed, cursing the fog. Then it occurred to him that it would mask his advance. Conan could not see him coming. He would be at the Cimmerian's back before the noonday sun dispelled the mists. Just now he could not tell what lay on either hand, whether cliffs, thickets, or gorges. The drum throbbed unceasingly, growing louder as they advanced, but they heard no more of the battle. Valerius had no idea toward what point of the compass they were headed. He started as he saw gray rock walls looming through the smoky drifts on either hand, and realized that they were riding through a narrow defile. But the guide showed no sign of nervousness, and Valerius hove a sigh of relief when the walls widened out and became invisible in the fog. They were through the defile. If an ambush had been planned, it would have been made in that pass. But now Tiberius halted again. The drum was rumbling louder, and Valerius could not determine from what direction the sound was coming. Now it seemed ahead of him, now behind, now on one hand or the other. Valerius glared about him impatiently, sitting on his war-horse with wisps of mist curling about him and the moisture gleaming on his armor. Behind him, the long lines of steel-clad riders faded away and away like phantoms into the mist. "Why do you tarry, dog?" he demanded. The man seemed to be listening to the ghostly drum. Slowly, he straightened in his saddle, turned his head, and faced Valerius, and the smile on his lips was terrible to see. "The fog is thinning, Valerius," he said in a new voice, pointing a bony finger. "Look." The drum was silent. The fog was fading away. First, the crests of cliffs came in sight above the gray clouds, tall and spectral. Lower and lower crawled the mists, shrinking, fading. Valerius started up in his stirrups with a cry that the horsemen echoed behind him. On all sides of them the cliffs towered. They were not in a wide open valley, as he had supposed. They were in a blind gorge walled by sheer cliffs hundreds of feet high. The only entrance or exit was that narrow defile through which they had ridden. "Dog!" Valerius struck Tiberius full in the mouth with his clenched, mailed hand. "What devil's trick is this?" Tiberius spat out a mouthful of blood and shook with fearful laughter. "A trick that shall rid the world of a beast. Look, dog!" Again Valerius cried out, more in fury than in fear. The defile was blocked by a wild and terrible band of men who stood silent as images, ragged, shock-headed men with spears in their hands, hundreds of them. And up on the cliffs appeared other faces, thousands of faces, wild, gaunt, ferocious faces, marked by fire and steel and starvation. A trick of Conan's!" raged Valerius.
"Conan knows nothing of it," laughed Tiberius. "It was the plot of broken men, of men you ruined and turned to beasts. Amalric was right. Conan has not divided his army. We are the rabble who followed him, the wolves who skulk in these hills, the homeless men, the hopeless men. This was our plan, and the priests of Ashura aided us with their mist. Look at them, Valerius. Each bears the mark of your hand, on his body or on his heart. Look at me. You do not know me, do you? What of this scar your hangman burned upon me? Once you knew me. Once I was lord of Amelius, the man whose sons you murdered, whose daughter your mercenaries ravished and slew. You said I would not sacrifice my trap to you? Almighty gods, if I had 1,000 lives, I would give them all to buy your doom. And I have bought it. Look on the men you broke, dead men who once played the king. Their hour has come. This gorge is your tomb. Try to climb the cliffs. They are steep. They are high. Try to fight your way back through the defile. Spears will block your path. Boulders will crush you from above. Dog, I will be waiting for you in hell." Throwing back his head, he laughed until the rocks rang. Valerius leaned from his saddle and slashed down with his great sword, severing shoulder bone and breast. Tiberius sank to the earth, still laughing gastily through a gurgle of gushing blood. The drums had begun again, encircling the gorge with guttural thunder. Boulders came crashing down. Above the screams of dying men shrilled the arrows in blinding clouds from the cliffs. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hour of the Dragon. Chapter 22. The Road to Acheron. Dawn was just whitening the east when Amalric drew up his hosts in the mouth of the Valley of Lions. This valley was flanked by low, rolling but steep hills, and the floor pitched upward in a series of irregular natural terraces. On the uppermost of these terraces Conan's army held its position, awaiting the attack. The host that had joined him, marching down from Gunderland, had not been composed exclusively of spearmen. With them had come 7,000 Bossonian archers, and 4,000 barons and their retainers of the north and west, swelling the ranks of his cavalry. The pikemen were drawn up in a compact wedge-shaped formation at the narrow head of the valley. There were 19,000 of them, mostly gundermen, though some 4,000 were Aquilonians of other provinces. They were flanked on either hand by 5,000 Bossonian archers. Behind the ranks of the pikemen, the knights sat their steeds motionless, lances raised. 10,000 knights of Poitou, 9,000 Aquilonians, barons and their retainers. It was a strong position. His flanks could not be turned, for that would mean climbing the steep wooded hills in the teeth of the arrows and swords of the Bossonians. His camp lay directly behind him in a narrow, steep-walled valley, which was indeed merely a continuation of the Valley of Lions, pitching up at a higher level. He did not fear a surprise from the rear, because the hills behind him were full of refugees and broken men whose loyalty to him was beyond question. But if his position was hard to shake, it was equally hard to escape from. It was a trap as well as a fortress for the defenders, a desperate last stand of men who did not expect to survive unless they were victorious. The only line of retreat possible was through the narrow valley at their rear. Zaltotun mounted a hill on the left side of the valley near the wide mouth. This hill rose higher than the others and was known as the King's Altar, for a reason long forgotten. Only Zaltotun knew, and his memory dated back 3,000 years. He was not alone.
His two familiars, silent, hairy, furtive, and dark, were with him, and they bore a young Aquilonian girl, bound hand and foot. They laid her on an ancient stone which was curiously like an altar, and which crowned the summit of the hill. For long centuries it had stood there, worn by the elements, until many doubted that it was anything but a curiously shapen natural rock. But what it was and why it stood there, Zaltotun remembered from of old. The familiars went away, with their bent backs like silent gnomes, and Zaltotun stood alone beside the altar, his dark beard blown in the wind, overlooking the valley. He could see clear back to the winding Shirki, and up into the hills beyond the head of the valley. He could see the gleaming wedge of steel drawn up at the head of the terraces, the burgonets of the archers glinting among the rocks and bushes, the silent knights motionless on their steeds, their pennons flowing above their helmets, their lances rising in a bristling thicket. Looking in the other direction, he could see the long serried lines of the Nemedians moving in ranks of shining steel into the mouth of the valley. Behind them, the gay pavilions of the lords and knights and the drab tents of the common soldiers stretched back almost to the river. Like a river of molten steel, the Nemedian host flowed into the valley, the great scarlet dragon rippling over it. First marched the bowmen, in even ranks, arbalests half raised, bolts knocked, fingers on triggers. After them came the pikemen, and behind them the real strength of the army, the mounted knights, their banners unfurled to the wind, their lances lifted, walking their great steeds forward as if they rode to a banquet. And higher up the slopes, the smaller Aquilonian host stood grimly silent. There were 30,000 Nemedian knights, and, as in most Hyborian nations, it was the chivalry which was the sword of the army. The footmen were used only to clear the way for a charge of the armored knights. There were 21,000 of these, pikemen and archers. The bowmen began loosing as they advanced, without breaking ranks, launching their quarrels with a whir and tang. But the bolts fell short or rattled harmlessly from the overlapping shields of the gundermen. And before the arbalesters could come within killing range, the arching shafts of the Bossonians were wreaking havoc in their ranks. A little of this, a futile attempt at exchanging fire, and the Nemedian bowmen began falling back in disorder. Their armor was light, their weapons no match for the Bossonian longbows. The western archers were sheltered by bushes and rocks. Moreover, the Nemedian footmen lacked something of the morale of the horsemen, knowing as they did that they were being used merely to clear the way for the knights. The crossbowmen fell back, and between their opening lines the pikemen advanced. These were largely mercenaries, and their masters had no compunction about sacrificing them. They were intended to mask the advance of the knights until the latter were within smiting distance. So, while the arbalesters plied their bolts from either flank at long range, the pikemen marched into the teeth of the blast from above, and behind them the knights came on. When the pikemen began to falter beneath the savage hail of death that whistled down the slopes among them, a trumpet blew, their companies divided to right and left, and through them the mailed knights thundered. They ran full into a cloud of stinging death. The cloth-yard shafts found every crevice in their armor and the housings of the steeds. Horses scrambling up the grassy terraces reared and plunged backward, bearing their riders with them. Steel-clad forms littered the slopes. The charge wavered and ebbed back. Back down in the valley, Amalric reformed his ranks. Tarascus was fighting with drawn sword under the Scarlet Dragon, but it was the Baron of Tor who commanded that day. Amalric swore as he glanced at the forest of lance-tips visible above and beyond the headpieces of the gundermen. He had hoped his retirement would draw the knights out in a charge down the slopes after him, to be raked from either flank by his bowmen and swamped by the numbers of his horsemen. But they had not moved. Camp servants brought skins of water from the river. Knights doffed their helmets and drenched their sweating heads. The wounded on the slopes screamed vainly for water. In the upper valley, spring supplied the defenders. They did not thirst that long, hot spring day. On the king's altar, beside the ancient carven stone, Zaltotun watched the steel tide ebb and flow. On came the knights, with waving plumes and dipping lances. Through a whistling cloud of arrows they plowed to break like a thundering wave on the bristling wall of spears and shields. Axes rose and fell above the plumed helmets, spears thrust upward, bringing down horses and riders. The pride of the Gundermen was no less fierce than that of the knights. They were not spear fodder to be sacrificed for the glory of better men. They were the finest infantry in the world, with a tradition that made their morale unshakable. The kings of Aquilonia had long learned the worth of unbreakable infantry. They held their formation unshaken. Over their gleaming ranks flowed the great lion banner, and at the tip of the wedge a giant figure in black armor roared and smote like a hurricane, with a dripping axe that split steel and bone alike. The Nemedians fought as gallantly as their traditions of high courage commanded, but they could not break the iron wedge, and from the wooded knolls on either hand arrows raked their close-packed ranks mercilessly. Their own bowmen were useless, their pikemen unable to climb the heights and come to grips with the Bossonians. Slowly, stubbornly, sullenly, the grim knights fell back, counting their empty saddles. Above them, the Gundermen made no outcry of triumph. They closed their ranks, blocking up the gaps made by the fallen. Sweat ran into their eyes from under their steel caps. They gripped their spears and waited, their fierce hearts swelling with pride that a king should fight on foot with them. Behind them, the Aquilonian knights had not moved. They sat their steeds, grimly immobile. A knight spurred a sweating horse up the hill called the king's altar, and glared at Zaltotun with bitter eyes. "Amalric bids me say that it is time to use your magic, wizard," he said. "We are dying like flies down there in the valley. We cannot break their ranks." Zaltotun seemed to expand, to grow tall and awesome and terrible. "Return to Amalric," he said. "Tell him to reform his ranks for a charge, but to await my signal. Before that signal is given, he will see a sight that he will remember until he lies dying." The knight saluted as if compelled against his will, and thundered down the hill at breakneck pace. Zaltotun stood beside the dark altar stone and stared across the valley, at the dead and wounded men on the terraces, at the grim, blood-stained band at the head of the slopes, at the dusty, steel-clad ranks reforming in the vale below. He glanced up at the sky, and he glanced down at the slim white figure on the dark stone. And, lifting a dagger inlaid with archaic hieroglyphs, he intoned an immemorial invocation. "Set, god of darkness, scaly lord of the shadows, by the blood of a virgin and the sevenfold symbol, I call to your sons below the black earth. Children of the deeps, below the red earth, under the black earth, awaken and shake your awful manes. Let the hills rock and the stones topple upon my enemies. Let the sky grow dark above them, the earth unstable beneath their feet. Let a wind from the deep black earth curl up beneath their feet and blacken and shrivel them." He halted short, dagger lifted. In the tense silence, the roar of the host rose beneath him, borne on the wind. On the other side of the altar stood a man in a black hooded robe, whose coif shadowed pale, delicate features and dark eyes calm and meditative. "Dog of Asura," whispered Zaltotun. His voice was like the hiss of an angered serpent. "Are you mad that you seek your doom? O Baal, Chiron!" "Call again, dog of Acheron," said the other, and laughed. "Summon them loudly. They will not hear, unless your shouts reverberate in hell." From a thicket on the edge of the crest came a somber old woman in peasant garb, her hair flowing over her shoulders, a great grey wolf following at her heels.
"Witch, priest, and wolf," muttered Zaltotum grimly, and laughed. "Fools, to pit your charlatan's mummery against my arts! With a wave of my hand, I brush you from my path."
"Your arts are straws in the wind, dog of Python," answered the Acheron. "Have you wondered why the Shirki did not come down in flood and trap Conan on the other bank? When I saw the lightning in the night, I guessed your plan, and my spells dispersed the clouds you had summoned before they could empty their torrents. You did not even know that your rain-making wizardry had failed."
"You lie!"
cried Zaltotum, but the confidence in his voice was shaken.
"I have felt the impact of a powerful sorcery against mine, but no man on earth could undo the rain magic, once made, unless he possessed the very heart of sorcery."
"But the flood you plotted did not come to pass," answered the priest. "Look at your allies in the valley, Pythonian. You have led them to the slaughter. They are caught in the fangs of the trap, and you cannot aid them. Look." He pointed. Out of the narrow gorge of the upper valley, behind the Poitanians, a horseman came flying, whirling, something about his head that flashed in the sun. Recklessly he hurtled down the slopes, through the ranks of the gundermen, who sent up a deep-throated roar and clashed their spears and shields like thunder in the hills. On the terraces between the hosts, the sweat-soaked horse reared and plunged, and his wild rider yelled and brandished the thing in his hands like one demented. It was the torn remnant of a scarlet banner, and the sun struck dazzlingly on the golden scales of a serpent that writhed thereon.
"Valerius is dead!" cried Hadrathus ringingly. "A fog and a drum lured him to his doom. I gathered that fog, dog of Python, and I dispersed it. I, with my magic, which is greater than your magic." "What matters it?" roared Zaltotum, a terrible sight, his eyes blazing, his features convulsed. "Valerius was a fool. I do not need him. I can crush Conan without human aid."
"Why have you delayed?" mocked Hadrathus. "Why have you allowed so many of your allies to fall pierced by arrows and spitted on spears?"
"Because blood aids great sorcery," thundered Zaltotum in a voice that made the rocks quiver. A lurid nimbus played about his awful head. "Because no wizard wastes his strength thoughtlessly. Because I would conserve my powers for the great days to be, rather than employ them in a hill-country brawl. But now, by Set, I shall loose them to the uttermost. Watch, dog of Asura, false priest of an outworn god, and see a sight that shall blast your reason for evermore."
Hadrathus threw back his head and laughed, and hell was in his laughter. "Look, black devil of Python!" His hand came from under his robe holding something that flamed and burned in the sun, changing the light to a pulsing golden glow in which the flesh of Zaltotum looked like the flesh of a corpse. Zaltotum cried out as if he had been stabbed. "The heart! The heart of Ahriman!" "Aye, the one power that is greater than your power." Zaltotum seemed to shrivel, to grow old. Suddenly his beard was shot with snow, his locks flecked with grey. "The heart," he mumbled. "You stole it! Dog! Thief!" "Not I. It has been on a long journey far to the southward. But now it is in my hands, and your black arts cannot stand against it. As it resurrected you, so shall it hurl you back into the night whence it drew you. You shall go down the dark road to Acheron, which is the road of silence and the night. The dark empire, unreborn, shall remain a legend and a black memory. Conan shall reign again, and the heart of Ahriman shall go back into the cavern below the temple of Mitra, to burn as a symbol of the power of Aquilonia for 1,000 years." Zaltotun screamed inhumanly and rushed around the altar, dagger lifted. But from somewhere, out of the sky perhaps, or the great jewel that blazed in the hand of Hadrathus, shot a jetting beam of blinding blue light. Full against the breast of Zaltotun it flashed, and the hills re-echoed the concussion. The wizard of Acheron went down as though struck by a thunderbolt, and before he touched the ground he was fearfully altered. Beside the altar stone lay no fresh slain corpse, but a shriveled mummy, a brown, dry, unrecognizable carcass sprawling among moldering swathings. Somberly, old Zaleta looked down. "He was not a living man," she said. "The heart lent him a false aspect of life that deceived even himself. I never saw him as other than a mummy." Hadrathus bent to unbind the swooning girl on the altar, when from among the trees appeared a strange apparition, Zaltotun's chariot drawn by the weird horses. Silently they advanced to the altar and halted, with the chariot wheel almost touching the brown withered thing on the grass. Hadrathus lifted the body of the wizard and placed it in the chariot, and without hesitation the uncanny steeds turned and moved off southward, down the hill. And Hadrathus and Zaleta and the Grey Wolf watched them go, down the long road to Acheron, which is beyond the ken of men. Down in the valley, Amalric had stiffened in his saddle when he saw that wild horseman curvetting and caracoling on the slopes while he brandished that blood-stained serpent banner. Then some instinct jerked his head about, toward the hill known as the King's Altar. And his lips parted. Every man in the valley saw it, an arching shaft of dazzling light that towered up from the summit of the hill, showering golden fire. High above the hosts it burst in a blinding blaze that momentarily paled the sun. "That's not Zaltotun's signal!" roared the Baron. "No," shouted Tarascus. "It's a signal to the Aquilonians! Look!" Above them, the immobile ranks were moving at last, and a deep-throated roar thundered across the vale. "Zaltotun has failed us!" bellowed Amalric furiously. "Valerius has failed us! We have been led into a trap! Mitra's curse on Zaltotun, who led us here! Sound the retreat!" "Too late!" yelled Tarascus. "Look!" Up on the slopes, the forest of lances dipped, leveled. The ranks of the Gundermen rolled back to the right and left like a parting rain, and with a thunder like the rising roar of a hurricane, the knights of Aquilonia crashed down the slopes. The impetus of that charge was irresistible. Bolts driven by the demoralized arbalesters glanced from their shields, their bent helmets. Their plumes and pennons streaming out behind them, their lances lowered, they swept over the wavering lines of pikemen and roared down the slopes like a wave. Amalric yelled an order to charge, and the Nemedians with desperate courage spurred their horses at the slopes. They still outnumbered the attackers. But they were weary men on tired horses, charging uphill. The onrushing knights had not struck a blow that day. Their horses were fresh. They were coming downhill, and they came like a thunderbolt. And like a thunderbolt, they smote the struggling ranks of the Nemedians, smote them, split them apart, ripped them asunder, and dashed the remnants headlong down the slopes. After them on foot came the Gundermen, blood-mad, and the Bossonians were swarming down the hills, loosing as they ran at every foe that still moved. Down the slopes washed the tide of battle. The dazed Nemedians swept on the crest of the wave. Their archers had thrown down their arbalests and were fleeing. Such pikemen as had survived the blasting charge of the knights were cut to pieces by the ruthless Gundermen. In a wild confusion, the battle swept through the wide mouth of the valley and into the plain beyond. All over the plain swarmed the warriors, fleeing and pursuing, broken into single combat and clumps of smiting, hacking knights on rearing, wheeling horses. But the Nemedians were smashed, broken, unable to reform or make a stand. By the hundreds they broke away, spurring for the river. Many reached it, rushed across, and rode eastward. The countryside was up behind them. The people hunted them like wolves. Few ever reached Turantia. The final break did not come until the fall of Amalric. The Baron, striving in vain to rally his men, rode straight at the clump of knights that followed the giant in black armor, whose surcoat bore the royal lion, and over whose head floated the golden lion banner with the scarlet leopard of Poitou beside it. A tall warrior in gleaming armor couched his lance and charged to meet the Lord of Tor. They met like a thunderclap. The Nemedian's lance, striking his foe's helmet, snapped bolts and rivets and tore off the casque, revealing the features of Pallantides. But the Aquilonian's lance-head crashed through shield and breastplate to transfix the Baron's heart. A roar went up as Amalric was hurled from his saddle, snapping the lance that impaled him, and the Nemedians gave way as a barrier bursts under the surging impact of a tidal wave. They rode for the river in a blind stampede that swept the plain like a whirlwind. The hour of the dragon had passed. Tarascus did not flee. Amalric was dead, the color-bearer slain, and the royal Nemedian banner trampled in the blood and dust. Most of his knights were fleeing, and the Aquilonians were riding them down. Tarascus knew the day was lost, but with a handful of faithful followers he raged through the melee, conscious of but one desire: to meet Conan the Cimmerian. And at last he met him. Formations had been destroyed utterly, close-knit bands broken asunder and swept apart. The crest of Trocero gleamed in one part of the plain, those of Prospero and Pallantides in others. Conan was alone. The house troops of Tarascus had fallen one by one. The two kings met man to man. Even as they rode at each other, the horse of Tarascus sobbed and sank under him. Conan leapt from his own steed and ran at him, as the king of Nemedia disengaged himself and rose. Steel flashed blindingly in the sun, clashed loudly, and blue sparks flew. Then a clang of armor as Tarascus measured his full length on the earth beneath a thunderous stroke of Conan's broadsword. The Cimmerian placed a mail-shod foot on his enemy's breast and lifted his sword. His helmet was gone. He shook back his black mane, and his blue eyes blazed with their old fire. "Do you yield?" "Will you give me quarter?" demanded the Nemedian. "Aye, better than you'd have given me, you dog. Life for you and all your men who throw down their arms. Though I ought to split your head for an infernal thief," the Cimmerian added. Tarascus twisted his neck and glared over the plain. The remnants of the Nemedian host were flying across the stone bridge with swarms of victorious Aquilonians at their heels, smiting with fury of glutted vengeance. Bossonians and gundermen were swarming through the camp of their enemies, tearing the tents to pieces in search of plunder, seizing prisoners, ripping open the baggage, and upsetting the wagons. Tarascus cursed fervently, and then shrugged his shoulders, as well as he could under the circumstances. "Very well, I have no choice. What are your demands?" "Surrender to me all your present holdings in Aquilonia. Order your garrisons to march out of the castles and towns they hold without their arms, and get your infernal armies out of Aquilonia as quickly as possible. In addition, you shall return all Aquilonians sold as slaves, and pay an indemnity to be designated later, when the damage your occupation of the country has caused has been properly estimated. You will remain as hostage until these terms have been carried out." "Very well," surrendered Tarascus. "I will surrender all the castles and towns now held by my garrisons without resistance, and all the other things shall be done. What ransom for my body?" Conan laughed and removed his foot from his foe's steel-clad breast, grasped his shoulder, and heaved him to his feet. He started to speak, then turned to see Hadrathus approaching him. The priest was as calm and self-possessed as ever, picking his way between rows of dead men and horses. Conan wiped the sweat-smeared dust from his face with a blood-stained hand. He had fought all through the day, first on foot with the pikemen, then in the saddle leading the charge. His surcoat was gone, his armor splashed with blood and battered with strokes of sword, mace, and axe. He loomed gigantically against a background of blood and slaughter, like some grim pagan hero of mythology. "Well done, Hadrathus," quoth he gustily. "By Crum, I'm glad to see your signal. My knights were almost mad with impatience and eating their hearts out to be at sword strokes. I could not have held them much longer. What of the wizard?" "He has gone down the dim road to Acheron," answered Hadrathus, "and I am for Terentia. My work is done here, and I have a task to perform at the temple of Mitra. All our work is done here. On this field we have saved Aquilonia, and more than Aquilonia. Your ride to your capital will be a triumphal procession through a kingdom mad with joy. All Aquilonia will be cheering the return of their king, and so, until we meet again in the great royal hall, farewell." Conan stood silently watching the priest as he went. From various parts of the field knights were hurrying toward him. He saw Pallantides, Trocero, Prospero, Servius Galanus, their armor splashed with crimson. The thunder of the battle was giving way to a roar of triumph and acclaim. All eyes, hot with strife and shining with exultation, were turned toward the great black figure of the king. Mailed arms brandished red-stained swords. A confused torrent of sound rose, deep and thunderous as the sea surf. "Hail, Conan, King of Aquilonia!" Tarascus spoke. "You have not yet named my ransom." Conan laughed and slapped his sword home in its scabbard. He flecked his mighty arms and ran his blood-stained fingers through his thick black locks, as if feeling there his re-won crown. "There is a girl in your seraglio named Zenobia." "Why, yes, so there is." "Very well." The king smiled as at an exceedingly pleasant memory. "She shall be your ransom, and naught else. I will come to Belvris for her, as I promised. She was a slave in Nemedia, but I will make her queen of Aquilonia." The end of The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard.